My awakening began with a simple question. It occurred when I saw a familiar clip showing President Bush on the morning of 9/11. Bush is sitting at Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida at 9:05 a.m. when White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card whispers the following into the president's ear.
The plane has hit the second tower. America is under attack.
The big question is this. Why didn't the Secret Service get him out of there immediately? They didn't know how many planes were hijacked yet or what their targets were. And soon after looking, I was reminded that there were several incredible events that day, including a third building that fell at the World Trade Center. I had put almost no thought into the particulars of that day for 10 years, but that was about to change. In chronological order, the official version goes like this. 4 planes were hijacked by 19 mostly Saudi Arabian terrorists who then flew or attempted to fly those planes into 4 U.S. buildings. 3 of them were successful. American Airlines Flight 11 hit the first tower, the North Tower, at 8:46 a.m. United Flight 175 hit the South Tower at 9:03 a.m.
So if you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever, and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it.
This would have us to believe that these was a typical office fire, scattered office fires, if you will, that brought this building down. Since the mid-60s, I've tried to follow high-rise fires, and I'm not aware of any high-rise building that have come down as a result of fires.
Fires in high-rises have never brought down a steel frame high-rise building at all, ever.
When I see John Gross fidgeting as he states there was no molten metal, I see a man that is uncomfortable, maybe because he's doing something that a part of himself disagrees with. It's basic human nature. My feelings at the time were like the moment you catch your significant other in a big lie. Maybe there's an explanation, but it doesn't look good. And if something like that's ever happened to you, you may understand needing to know more, but not wanting to know more, if that makes sense. Was there more evidence of explosives besides just booms and molten steel? I needed more before I could get my head around this. The collapse never looked right to me, but then again I never really thought that it defied the laws of physics. Could the hijackers have wired the buildings? Maybe the government didn't want us to know how really lax our security was, and that's why they covered up this fact. Maybe it was pre-wired for some reason, but that made no sense. If it was a controlled demolition, it would explain how those buildings were reduced to neat piles of rubble. It would explain why the towers fell after burning for only an hour or so. It would explain why they imploded instead of tearing apart. It would explain why they all fell at free fall speed. It sure looked like a controlled demolition, in retrospect. I couldn't stop at this point. I needed to know more. Late nights, coffee, research. My life was changing before my very eyes. I had taken my very first step down the rabbit hole. Little did I know how much deeper it would go. Squibs are the 7th indicator of a controlled demolition. In demolition vernacular, squibs refer to visible blasts from explosive charges. Often they are visible through mistiming or malfunction in some way. Usually they are hidden in the debris cloud. In simple terms, squibs are visual evidence of explosives. Squibs were recorded from the moment of the plane impacts through the collapse of the towers. For me, they went unnoticed until I looked at the video more closely. These stills captured squibs as the towers collapsed. I didn't think poofs of smoke should be coming out of buildings whose fires are dozens of floors above. The official version stated these squibs were compressed air caused by the pancaking floors, which squeezed the air to the point of bursting out a window. The seal of the building was broken when the collapse began. Logically, if it was compressed air, it should have found the path of least resistance, through the broken part of the building. It shouldn't have knocked out a window here or a window there, as many as 40 floors below the blast wave.
Naysayers tend to say, well, that's just air being blown out the windows. It doesn't really work to say it's just air pressure. You know, estimated these are coming out faster than 100 miles an hour.
The following clips show multiple squibs popping out, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes dozens of floors away from each other. Of all of the 9/11 information I've come across, this may have been the easiest to spot, and yet it provided me with one of those stark moments in which the reality of 9/11 sunk in to a new level. Logic beat out my former dismissive, conventional thinking self, who would have never considered any of this remotely possible before. But it wasn't until understanding nanothermite and how it's made and who has it that I considered, for the first time, that someone other than the hijackers had to be involved. And as scary as it was to consider, it might even be homegrown. Hundreds of questions were competing for space in my little brain. Why would underfunded, unsophisticated guys in caves pay to make or buy nanothermite? Who would sell it to them? How did they get access to the buildings every day? How did they detonate Building 7 long after they died? If you have the means, and go to the trouble of getting nanothermite and wiring the building, why let the plan rest on using box cutters to overthrow military and combat-trained airline pilots, along with dozens of passengers? Why bother killing yourself in a plane crash at all if it wasn't needed to take the buildings down? The odds that one company can link so many vital elements of 9/11 is pretty astonishing. But more astonishing is there's no mention of Stratosec or Securicom in the entire 567-page 9/11 Commission report. Of course, that was no surprise by now. Did I forget to mention that the same 9/11 Commission did not mention Building 7 a single time in the entire report either?
Why is there not a word about the collapse of that building in the 9/11 Commission report?
We didn't see any evidence of the kind of thing you're talking about.
I didn't think this was something done by a terrorist anymore, nor did I think this was done by a president. How does he get nanothermite? How does he get NORAD, the FAA, and our air defenses to look the other way? Or get access to the interior of all 3 towers? Or get 19 guys to kill themselves? Or get NIST and the 9/11 Commission to tank their investigations? Or keep the media quiet? Or keep a rival administration from exposing it? Now, this seemed much bigger than even a president, and impossible for a man on the run. If someone like me with a budget of 0 can find something wrong with Building 7's collapse, how could an entire government commission not even mention it? Something big and strange was coming into view, seemingly coordinated and almost invisible, like 1,000 puzzle pieces dumped out before me. I kept replaying the event in my head over and over, assimilating each new piece of information as I discovered it. And like a retreating army, my line in the sand about what could have really happened kept moving further and further back, and getting closer to home. But I was on a mission, and I was obsessed to find out the truth. Researching late every night was starting to disrupt my home life. My wife didn't exactly see eye to eye with me about 9/11. Back then, she still believed the official version, but she hadn't seen what I had. With that said, it was still troubling to find a pattern of bullying, intimidation, and belittling of anyone asking valid questions. Actually, it made me quite angry.
We're not buying it.
Okay, you don't have to buy anything. You're American. You want to be a nut, you can be a nut. And you are a nut. Anybody who thinks that 9/11 was carried out by the government isn't a truther. They're idiots.
I'm merely saying it is wrong, blasphemous, and sinful for you to suggest, imply, or help other people come to the conclusion that the U.S. government killed 3,000 of its own citizens, because it didn't.
How big a lunatic do you have to be to watch 2 giant airliners packed with jet fuel slam into buildings on live TV, igniting a massive inferno that burned for 2 hours, and then think, well, if you believe that was the cause?
Most reasonable people would question the official story after seeing what we've seen. Is it so implausible to not even allow a question? I wondered what motivated them, because it obviously wasn't a search for the truth. Well, so much for mainstream news. I started going to independent news sources. All these early news reports were glaring misfires in what seemed to be an otherwise coordinated media campaign. Misfires not unlike the ones meant to coincide with the first plane impact. Little mistakes that my untrained eye never picked up before, but that I was now finding all over, spawning even more questions, and fueling the early stages of what would become my spiritual awakening.
The flight you're referring to is the
flight that came into the Pentagon.
The Mineta testimony launched my investigation into the Pentagon, Shanksville, the hijackers, and many other aspects of 9/11. And if I thought I was a long way down the rabbit hole already, was I way wrong. My belief system would ultimately be shattered, but rebuilt to accommodate my evolving worldview. Back then, however, I was only a few months into my investigation, and I was going through a full scope of emotions, and frankly having a difficult time handling all of them. Denial, curiosity, fear, disbelief, paranoia, anger, and heartbreak, and I would go through many more. I was still unable to reconcile all the data in front of me. I couldn't see the bigger picture at the time. But like the wind, it can't be seen, yet we know it's there because it leaves evidence of its existence. Very much like the trail of breadcrumbs I'd been researching over the last few months. But it's not something I could understand in one sitting. It took time.